possible world we want to see built. You'll see more information on our action labs, our course information, point you also to our land acknowledgement, the syllabus, and the course objectives. Next slide, please. Just some reminders of maintaining yourself on mute unless you are asking a question or being called on. We have language justice through live interpretation, just mindful of Zoom controls, and we do have a content warning that suggests that some of the topics covered in these lectures are difficult and they may touch us in our personal lives. If you need to step away, please do so to take care of yourself. And remember to choose a language that you would like to hear this session in. Next slide. I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, Adria Husband. Just to talk a little bit about the organization, Chicago Unity for Equity. It is a community of racial justice advocates that are working together across neighborhoods, organization, and policy issues. Adria Husband brings over 25 years of extensive expertise in educational leadership, operations management, and organizational development to her commitment as an advocate for racial and social justice. Her journey spans orchestrating systemic, social, emotional development initiatives for students in grades K through 12 across 20 large urban school districts, as well as championing policies and practices for equitable distribution of education resources to historically underserved communities in Chicago. Adria excels in facilitating organizational cultural shifts, problem identification, and creative process design. Some of Adria's most recent work has included a focus in shifting philanthropic policy and practice to allocate resources to historically marginalized BIPOC organizations and communities by way of centering the voices and experiences of leaders of color. Adria consults organizations around culturally responsive practices in policy, program delivery, and workplace practices. Adria also enjoys serving as a coach to BIPOC leaders across sectors to support their well-being for sustainability as they carry on their work as leaders in racial and social justice. Driven by a profound dedication to infuse healing and restoration into equity and justice work, Adria embodies roles as a coach, facilitator, mediator, and cultivator of individual gifts. Beyond her professional pursuits, Adria is a devoted mother to an amazing daughter in college and a spirited Lhasa Apso doggy. In her cherished moments of leisure, she is an avid house music dancer and indulges her passion for writing poetry, and crafting, enriching her life with creative expression and introspection. And with that, I'll take it away and give it over to the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for that great introduction. I'm really excited to be here with all of you tonight, and what a turnout on a Thursday evening. And happy to be here with all of you to talk a bit about the People's Budget and the participatory process that took place a couple years ago now. So I won't spend too much time talking anymore about my background, but hopeful that through the course of the time we have together tonight, we can engage and I can learn from you as much as hopefully you walk away with some learning this evening. So I'm going to jump right in and get started just talking about the People's Budget and the participatory budget process, because that's why we're here this evening. So just as a quick poll for the folks in the room, does anyone happen to know how large or what that number is, the magic number for the 2024 city budget, Chicago city budget. So if you happen to know or have some guesses, go ahead and put some of those in the chat. I would love to just hear from folks. No guesses so far. No idea. Yeah. 330 million is one. Good guess. Any others? And it's totally okay. No wrong answers. A few billion, 15 billion. You're really close. 1 billion, 10 billion. Awesome. Thank you for, for those guesses. So the answer is $16.6 billion. So yeah, huge, huge amount of money. And as we know, the city budget is fueled by our dollars, taxpayer dollars. And so the real basis, the whole concept of participatory budgeting and where the people's budget originated, the whole idea and concept behind it is since we own those dollars and we're funding essentially public services and all of the benefits that the city and the city organizations provide, we should have some say-so over how those dollars are allocated and what's important to us. And so that was really the origin for this idea of launching the people's budget process. And so really what, I know that all of you received a couple of resources to review prior to this evening, one of which was a facilitator's guide that kind of explains the process of hosting your own participatory budget. And we're going to get into that in great detail. And that's actually something you will walk away learning from this session this evening. The other piece of that homework that you had prior to the class was a video with a facilitated process of the people's budget. So we're going to take apart bits of that video and really get into it in detail. But I'm going to provide just some kind of overall context before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the conversation too. So a bit of what you read about, hopefully, or kind of gleaned from some of those resources prior to this evening, is one of the foundational questions that was posed as we went around and spoke to different members of community across the city, is what does your community need to be safe and thriving? So coming up with a really juicy question that no matter who you are, no matter how old you are, you have an answer for that question and you can contribute to the conversations. That was really important to identify a question that everyone could respond to. Everyone is going to have an opinion around that. And there were also, and really Chicago United for Equity as an entity and as an organization who is very much involved in community-based efforts, really is organized around 3 core values. And those are acknowledging history, shifting power, and embracing accountability. And so you'll see those things woven into the process. So at a very foundational level, the acknowledging history portion, the manner in which the communities that were identified to be centered in this process, this participatory process, the idea behind that was to identify which neighborhoods are the most disinvested neighborhoods across our city. And we want to go there because this is where the deepest inequities exist. And this is where the conditions of poverty play out most prevalently. And these are the voices that we intentionally want to center in this process. And so that's, taking into account the historical context in our city. And then through this process of going into community to center those voices, that's how we're activating that value of shifting power and then activating those voices to then take action to really ensure that the elected officials in our city are doing what we desire for them to do. based on the things that are most important to us. And that's leads us into that third value of embracing accountability. So what does that look like? Which is an ever kind of evolving process, and that can look a variety of ways, but we will touch upon that as well as we kind of walk through the course of the evening. So one resource that we wanted to share with you as well is there was a final report that was compiled by Chicago United for Equity. Thank you, Tiffany, for dropping that into the chat. And by the way, Tiffany is also going to be co-facilitating with me, and will chime in and be dropping things in the chat. So thank you so much, Tiffany, for that. So the resource that's in the chat is a really detailed, full-blown report from beginning to end about the process of this participatory budget. Has a lot more information than we'll have the ability to cover this evening. So this is an important thing for you to take with you. You can have that. But from the very beginning, talks through, again, how the communities were identified, also gets into some more concrete information around how were those 6 categories of the city budget identified. Because if you've ever ventured to take a look at any governmental financial documents, they are extremely complex, probably on purpose. And so one of the beautiful things about this people's budget process was the presentation, again, was so easy to access. No matter who you are, you understand housing means housing, and we can kind of, talk through the categories as well as we go through. But that translation piece was incredibly important in order for this process to go smoothly and make it accessible to no matter who you're speaking with. Additionally, in that guide, you'll see the recommendations that start on page 9 of that document and go in great detail through the end of the document. But again, as we're going to walk away this evening with the tools that you will each need if you wanted to host your own participatory budget process, you can pull from some of those recommendations, and it may be worthwhile to even follow up and see whether there's been progress since this report was published, whether there are still some advocacy points to carry forward, with government officials. And so those are just, I wanted to highlight those at this point, just to kind of call your attention to those. And please feel free at any point, as this is, again, an interactive space. If there are questions, if you'd like to pause and dig into something, feel free to do that. We will also leave some time at the end where we will have an open question and answer section. So just want to preface with that as well. And with that, I think we're ready to play a very brief video. This was not included in the homework or pre-work. And this is just a really nice overview of what the People's Budget was all about. So I'll pause here and we can watch it together.
Am I sharing the right screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay.
This year, the city of Chicago's budget was $12.6 billion. For 2021, our city is planning to spend even more, $13.5 billion. That's a lot of money, but no matter how much we have, we're always told there's not enough for our communities. What if the problem isn't how much we have, but how our politicians are spending it? If we could choose where our dollars go, how would we invest in building safe and thriving communities?
Homeownership, housing. Money to like to help people to build more houses. Community resources. The infrastructure of the schools that we already have here that aren't being used. Lack of quality education.
Education, community resources, and health. Definitely health.
Dealing with health, education, housing, infrastructure, and community resources. Something that I heard a lot from people was also
also mental health resources and health resources in general. Free health clinics, places to go, especially for things like mental health resources, housing and mental health.
More money put into mental health,
Education, housing and education and mental health.
more police accountability, and mental health.
For me, it's very important that torture survivors' voices are heard, as well as the disabled and those who suffer with mental health issues.
People. We have to put the time and the money into the actual person. Otherwise, the buildings won't matter when the people are too sick or mentally ill to appreciate them.
The People's Budget Chicago started with communities most impacted by historical disinvestment. Neighbors came together in Inglewood, Bronzeville, West Humboldt Park, Austin, Roseland, Uptown, Altvale Gardens, Ryden Park, and Greater Grand Crossing to answer the question, what do our communities need to be safe and thriving? They debated, negotiated, and ultimately worked together to build a budget that invests in a better future for all of us.
The People's Budget Chicago says that for every $100 of our tax money, we should spend $22 in health, 21 in housing, 19 in education, 19 in community resources, 12 in infrastructure, and 7 in the carceral system that includes policing and police accountability. This might seem obvious to most of us, but right now it's a huge shift from how our leaders spend our dollars. The People's Budget Chicago shows us that by reducing police spending, we have enough for our communities to invest in early childhood education, mental health, and healthcare, and affordable housing.
We need every person that believes in equitable and fair investment of city resources to reach out to their older people starting today. Call your older people, email them, mail them an old school handwritten letter, send them a tweet, and demand that they fight to create a city budget that reflects the needs and will of the people.
Yay.
Yay. Yes, I love that video, and I'm such a fan of the entire experience. Just giving a little more context to my involvement in the People's Budget. I was not involved in any of the data gathering, the research, the preparation, and I came in as a facilitator. So I was one of the people, similar to the woman in the video that you may have watched before tonight, who facilitated the conversation in the community meetings. And so my lens was coming into it and learning right on the spot. But again, it was such an easy process and immensely powerful. So I'm really excited that I get to come and talk about it. And then on the other side of that, what we'll also get into is I worked with the community representatives that were identified at each of the community meetings. And so we can talk a little bit more about that later in the process as well. So there was one more thing. Oh, the other thing that I remembered when we were watching the overview video is there's a whole other component of this. Again, with the idea being this is a participatory process, we wanted to get as many voices as possible to engage in what would you want to see the city budget spent on across these 6 categories. So another resource that you'll find in that the People's Budget full report that was dropped into the chat is there was an online component of the website where folks could go and actually vote, where they would put in their neighborhood, their racial demographic, and then do the budget game themselves. And so from there was really a huge amount of data collected through both community meetings as well as online that people could do at any given point in time. So people that we may not have been able, obviously wouldn't be able to reach because there were 9 communities prioritized, we were able to hear from all over the city. So wanted to just note that as well. So we are gonna start the process of breaking apart the actual people's budget meeting video. And so so kind of assuming that some of that pre-work and preparation prior to getting to the actual meeting has been done. And we're going to start at the point of, we're going to gather people together to have a conversation around the city budget and their priorities. And so just a question to pose to maybe get us started and warm us up for some conversation and engagement would be, who would you think about to kind of invite into this kind of conversation and to have a discussion about the allocation of city resources, or what, you know, your neighbors or friends might need or want to see their communities safe and thriving? So feel free to drop some notes in the chat. Who are some people you would want to invite to a meeting like this? Who comes to mind? Idealistically or ideally or realistically? I would say realistically. Neighbors, cousins, ward or district school representatives, community leaders, students, elders. Absolutely. Absolutely. Friends, family, the unhoused community, teachers, childcare providers, friends and family healthcare providers. These are all really, really great. Public health, students, absolutely. Again, it's gathering as many people as possible to hear from the voices across our city, across all demographics, to ensure that everyone's voice is heard. Local school councils, these are all great. And as you're bringing folks together who you may or may not have relationships with, what are some things, or even as you think about spaces that you're entering into, we can even use tonight. You know, we might be together with people that we may or may not know, but what are some key components of making folks feel comfortable in a space to really engage in conversation, talk about what could be really, in some cases, very sensitive or topics or issue areas that folks feel really passionate about. There's potential for folks to have alternatives in terms of their priorities and what folks feel is most important. So what might you consider when it comes to creating a space where folks feel comfortable? Food, absolutely. Food is a great way to bring folks together in community. Yes. What else? What else can you think about? Or what have you experienced that kind of helps you feel comfortable in a space to engage?
I think, I think it's a community when people feel comfortable, it's community that faith, spaces like that. And I believe for people get together and decide and have this conversation, they need to understand more about how you explain to us about where the money goes. Because the situation in community like my community, I'm from Little Village, we don't know nothing about it. We gone to the alderman. He's not saying nothing to us. We really not in the table to take decision, nothing like that. Especially right now, communities like Black and Latino community, we in survival mood when we thinking how we're gonna provide for the family. But I think at one point somebody come to explain and get that fire and say, enough is enough. Let's try to do something about it. Because sometimes when you not have documentation, you're so afraid even to say anything. But I think when somebody like you explain and told us, let's do, doesn't matter, you have voices here because you pay taxes.
Absolutely. Those are excellent, excellent points. You touched upon so many considerations. So ensuring that people understand, have enough background information to feel comfortable to speak about the topic is really important. Also addressing anything that may make people nervous to engage with a government official is absolutely a key component. And having options for folks who might want to do so in more anonymous ways, but as a constituent in an alderman's ward is absolutely, there are lots of options in ways to engage with government officials that feel safe. And so I'm just reviewing some of the comments in the chat too. So stepping up and stepping back in conversation, giving everyone opportunity to speak. The setup of chairs and seating, absolutely. Language interpreters, accessibility of the space, everyone introducing themselves. Yes, let's see what else is here. Providing background information to the topic. People using COVID safety measures. So really valid point, because we did the people's budget process during the pandemic. And so there was one point in time when the entire team caught COVID, and I was the one standing facilitator that did not happen to catch it. So absolutely, safety measures are important. Meeting on neutral ground. Thank you for mentioning this. This was also a very intentional strategy, and you'll notice that in the written documentation, also there's reference to the bus tour. So we went to the communities versus sometimes community engagement. The process itself is like, hey, community, come to this location and tell us what you think. No, again, this is about ensuring we're centering the voices of the people that we want to hear from. And so we want to make that as convenient as possible, and going into the community, into spaces that are already, gathering spaces or highly populated, and working with partner organizations who have those existing relationships. So again, it's kind of leveraging that established trust to bring folks in to feel comfortable that they're okay and they can, express themselves freely. So thank you for raising that. Setting community rules, absolutely. Talking about pronouns and having a name tag so that they're visible. All of those are great. Not too good, not too many government people at the meeting is a good point, potentially. And yeah, I would say for sure in the initial phases, like you might decide, and there were communities that did decide they wanted to put their alder on blast. And so they had a strategy in place, which we can also talk about some more later. But after having an initial one-on-one meeting and not getting the answers that they desired, they organized and did like a Facebook Live. I think we still have that. I can maybe we can share that as a follow-up. We have a Facebook Live event with one of the alders where these two young people just grilled their alder. It was amazing to watch. So I would love to share that with you later too. But these are all great points and good ways and just things to keep in mind as we are thinking about how to make people feel as comfortable as possible coming into the space so that they can engage fully. So with that, we're set up for our first section of the video that we're going to watch, which is around visioning. So I'll turn it over to Tiffany and we'll watch a little bit of the video.
As we're moving forward, one of the questions that I want you all to continue to think of and keep in mind as we're thinking of like the city budget, as we're thinking about these categories that are right in front of us, is what do our communities need to be safe and thriving? So I'm going to give you all this little paper whiteboard with the question that says, what do our communities need to be safe and thriving? You could draw a picture, you could write words that come to mind when you think about what our community need to be safe and thriving. You could write a paragraph, you could write a sentence, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Here you go. There's two. And then there should be 3 for you all. Just 2 pictures. Awesome. So we'll give you all a couple of minutes to kind of write down your response, to draw what comes to mind when you look at them. And then we'll share out. Okay, y'all ready? Awesome. Who would like to share first? Someone could volunteer.
I can volunteer.
Awesome, thank you.
So I drew 2 pictures and a couple words. Basically, it's just a bunch of people holding hands. And that kind of symbolizes like unity. And for the words, I put growth, leadership. We, of course, need hope because a lot of us probably know people that don't have hope in Chicago. So we need hope there. And then we need to educate the youth, most importantly, popcorn.
Sounds good. So I wrote first, I think community centers are really important, only because this area where people can actually gather and share ideas and meet other members of the community and not, feel isolated from each other, and also learn more about opportunities. Affordable housing, I think, is also really important because people need to feel safe. And then the next thing I do is early childhood resources because that's setting the community up for success later on in the future.
What I had chose, the first thing I chose was a good neighborhood because, of course, everybody wants to grow up in a good, safe, clean neighborhood, and that's probably going to affect like your mentality on like how you view your neighborhood, basically too. And I had chose like good education and how like more events like this could help like bring a lot of awareness to like other people about like what's happening stuff in all the world.
So I put free housing and healthcare, because I felt like housing or healthcare or really anything like shouldn't be tied to capital or income or wealth. I put violence prevention outside of the carceral system, and I also put green space. Your picture of trees.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't really put words. I just only drew pictures because I feel like when I think about what our communities need to be safe and thriving, like I just see it, you know what I mean? It's hard to like put it all into words. So I drew a street with sidewalks and a street sign. I drew trees as well, like green space. I drew a sun because I'm thinking about like environmental health and like just the air that we breathe and all of that. Like a health clinic, a library, a school, homes. I have a park. This is supposed to be some kind of sports ball. It's supposed to be a book. And then the hearts are like love. So yeah, so that's true.
Thank you so much. The documenters might ask you all for photos with them.
Thank you, Tiffany. And did anyone notice we had a special appearance by Tiffany in the video? Yes. So, yes, shout out. So prior to just a little bit prior to that clip that we just watched, the facilitator asked for consent to capture quotes and post images for the folks who were present. And they did go through the process of what was suggested in the chat, which was kind of setting some group agreements that they would engage with for the conversation. And so this was like the first prompt that folks responded to. And so why do you think this was an intentional start to the meeting? So why do you think it's important to start with sharing our visions in a meeting like this? So folks can, again, feel free to drop your responses in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off of mute, we could do either. So there's direction to the conversation, an objective for the group, absolutely. to understand where everyone is coming from, background, values, etc. Everyone has an equal voice. Absolutely. Great answers.
United in that same mission of that same vision about what we're gonna do.
Yes. Yep. Having a common vision, or each person sharing their own vision. Absolutely. It helps create an open space so people don't feel restricted on what they can say. Absolutely. People can see similarities and differences among the ideas. Absolutely. These are all great. Start positively. Yeah, it's a great way. Yeah, absolutely. Starting with a vision. So it's kind of a dreaming. You get into your creative part of your brain and think about what would we need, not the realities, which are often not what we are seeing or what we need, but visioning for the future and what we want and need. Yeah, Tiffany says it's almost like an icebreaker. Yeah, gets everyone talking, thinking, sharing, for sure. Yeah, and again, the question is so great because everyone has an answer. What does your community need to be safe and thriving? Every single one of us can give an answer, and no answer is wrong. Like, that's the beautiful thing about having a great question to really start the conversation. And for all of the reasons that you've identified, you can easily draw parallels, see where there are similarities, and or generate some things that maybe other folks didn't think about, like, oh yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, we do need that. Or yeah, absolutely. So all of these are all great reasons for starting the conversation with visioning and a question that everyone can respond to. All right, then we kind of get into after we've done some visioning, folks talk about it, hear each other, really unpack some of those ideas. Then we get into the section of the conversation where folks are doing the budget game. And so we're going to watch this next part of the video where the facilitator sets this up and then prompts them to place their first chip. So I will turn it over.
So now we're going to create a budget that's going to hopefully help reflect some of the imagining that you all have already started to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to start our people's budget activity. And you all are going to collectively have $100. Yeah, so you each get 20, and then collectively that would be 100. So if you could please grab 20. So I think each stack is 10. So if you could each grab 2 stacks. Okay. So what we're going to start off doing is you have 20, but everyone is going to think about what category is the most important to them. So everyone's going to place their first wood chip in the category that's most important to them. We'll go around and then we'll place it one by one, and I'll ask you to share out why you think that category is the most important for you. For each of these categories, there's subcategories. For carceral system, that includes police and police accountability. Community resources includes libraries, arts and culture, workforce services, youth and senior services, fire and emergency services. Infrastructure includes public transportation, water management, streets and sanitation, planning and development. Housing includes affordable housing, low income housing, and home ownership support. Education includes early childhood education. So for education, it only includes early childhood because Chicago Public Schools has their own budget system that runs separate from the city budget. So the city of Chicago budget only funds early childhood education. Just wanted to flag that. So it doesn't include elementary school, it doesn't include high schools. Health includes mental health, maternal and child health, HIV/AIDS prevention and support, and lead poisoning prevention. So wanted to keep that in mind. So as you're thinking about which category is the most important to you, as you're putting down your first wood chip, and also why. Thumbs up? Yeah, thumbs up. And would you like to go first, and we'll just go?
Do I explain or do I just place it?
Both.
So I'm gonna put my first one at health. I feel like obviously the rest are important, but like the most important thing for like an individual person or even a community is health. Like everyone has to be healthy. Even if we have education or even if we have a good carceral system, if we all walking around here like sick, it's not gonna work.
Thank you.
I'm also gonna put my first one on health, because health is really important, like when you're trying to be like involved in the community and stuff, because nobody wants to catch like anything from anybody else. So yeah, so that is pretty important.
Thank you.
I'm gonna put my first one in housing. Because it just feels like everyone needs their own space. That's affordable and accessible.
Thank you.
I also agree. I also put my first token on housing. Like I mentioned before, I feel like it starts off with having a safe space to live in order for you to thrive. So if everyone in the community has a space that they can live in and not to worry about their day-to-day, whether I have a place to live, I think that really is the foundation for a strong community.
Okay, so I was back and forth between health and housing. Ultimately, I'm gonna put my first one on housing. And really it's for a combination of everything y'all already said, right? Like I think if we think about, for example, people who are like houseless, like it's hard for them even to focus on their health because the first thing is finding a shelter, right? Like finding a place to like lay your head for real. So I think that's what that like back and forth is what made me put housing first. My first dollar on housing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. For example, like for housing, if you're like, I want to put a wooden coin for housing, but I want it for low income housing, you don't get to decide that. It just goes to the category as a whole. But you're just putting it on the overall housing, knowing that's what the subcategories are. What we're gonna do now.
Thank you for that. And now, since you're all queued up, we're going to launch a poll and ask you where you would place your first budget chip. So there'll be a Zoom poll appearing magically very shortly, and we'll ask you to place your vote. And we'll see where everyone lands. Since we're kind of just creating our own mini people's budget here tonight. So let's see where we land. Lots of votes coming in. Okay, we're at 74% participants, 75%. We're almost there. Okay.
Would you mind please repeating the categories so I can interpret for the people who don't know English?
Yes. So the 6 categories are health, education, housing, infrastructure, community resources, and the carceral system. Yeah, we are almost there. So interesting. Can everyone see the poll as it's calculating, or is it only at the end? I don't know.
I think
I can see it.
should be able to
Okay.
see it.
Everybody can see it. Okay. Yeah, so we'll leave a little bit more time for the remaining vote. Oh, polls ended. Okay. So where we landed, let's see, the highest rated 37% of us agreed with the video and that housing would be where folks place their first chip. The next runner-up is in health with 35%. And then third, we have community resources at 15%. and then 9% voted for education, and then kind of an equal spread for the remainder, with 2% of people saying infrastructure and another 2% saying the carceral system. So very interesting. And I'm wondering, and would love to hear from folks, why do you think it's important to think about where we would place our first chip, and especially think about yourselves facilitating a conversation with friends or neighbors, cousins, a variety of folks? Why would it be important to think about that first chip and where folks place their first chip?
I think it can be pretty easy to lose the plot when you have so many competing interests screaming in your ears all the time, when there are so many people who need so many different things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it offers, yeah, an opportunity to focus, and then gives, again, each individual the opportunity to voice why they think it's important, which is great for continued conversation. Are there other thoughts? Oh, and there's a comment in the chat. So you can zero in on what's most important to the people, thinking about where they put the chip. Absolutely. Are there any other thoughts on why this would be important?
It almost feels like a way of like naming your values a bit. Like, yeah, I think like where you would put your first dollar like says something about what you feel is like essential basically to what is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak from my own perspective too. It was actually in one of the sessions I facilitated, a young person who advocated for housing with his first chip, and shared very similar responses that we kind of heard in the video, but really just spoke to his own personal experience and the fact that when you don't have a home base, or if that's in jeopardy, or if you're worried about, where you're going to lay your head, it's really difficult to concentrate on those other categories. And so it kind of, since we landed in the same place tonight, with housing being the number one category that everyone kind of agreed would be, well, the majority of us agreed would be the highest priority, it's interesting to kind of think about that as well. Are there any other just thoughts or comments at this point? I know we've covered a good deal so far, but we can pause here. Does anyone want to kind of chime in on how the poll landed? Just any kind of thoughts or feedback at this point in time in the conversation? How does the poll normally land? It's a great question. So overall, and the budget, I'll point you back to that same resource. The People's Budget Report gives you great information, and the data is cut in different ways. You might not be surprised to find that it was consistent across the entire city, no matter who you spoke to, that the carceral system was the least funded component. And that may or may not be surprising to folks, but I think in this room, since that was lower on the priority list, that was consistent. Now, the reality was, and we'll see that later in the video as well, that is the highest funded aspect of the city budget. So a direct contradiction, right, to what we're hearing from across the city and where city resources are actually being allocated. So really interesting point. Can you say more about why you didn't want folks to allocate funding to subcategories under the larger pillars? Yes, so that's important. This goes, so again, speaking to the complexity of city budgets, they're often, in terms of how to get a number tied to these 6 very identifiable categories, the researcher or analyst who worked with Chicago United for Equity to really go through all of the departments of the city budget and identify, okay, this department works with public health, so that should go under the health category. Inevitably, there are some subcategories that will have to fall under that larger category. And so you can't necessarily then say, well, so I'll give an example of the carceral system. So under that carceral system category is also the, forget the name of the board that kind of also regulates and has oversight over like police conduct and things like that. So that might be something that is a good thing. We need more oversight and to ensure that they're doing and following protocol and treating people humanely. So we might want to fund that portion, but because it's under that larger umbrella of the carceral system, we don't have the choice just by the structure of the way that we're kind of doing this allocation process. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, the civilian office of, police accountability. That's right. That's what it's called. Yes. So I hope that answers your question too, Stephanie. There any other just questions or thoughts folks have before we continue on?
Adria, I wonder if this would be a good time to pause for a 5-minute break.
Oh, absolutely. We can take a little break. And I think, are we doing 5 minutes?
Yeah, let's do 5 minutes. That's all right.
All right. So everyone stretch your legs, take a break, get a drink of water, whatever you need to do, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Welcome back. Hope you had an opportunity to stretch your legs and take a little bit of a break. And we're entering into kind of the second half of our conversation. And just as a heads up, we will ask some questions that we'll want you to engage around. So get your fingers ready, or if you're more comfortable coming off of mute, there is quite a group of us. And so if we need to, we can also do some hand raising and kind of get in line that way. Just we'll see how it goes, but wanted to preface with that. So where we left off, we had just, at least in the video as well as in our virtual room, we placed our first chip to kind of indicate where our priorities lie in terms of how we'd like to see our dollars allocated. And so where we're going to pick back up on the video is everyone, as you recall, everyone got 20 tokens so that the total across 5 people totaled out to 100. So the math is kind of even and we can see where things fall. And so at this point in the video, everyone has allocated all 20 of their chips and we're going to see how they get to the final budget. So we'll watch that next.
This is 16, 14, 24, 15, and 27.
How do y'all feel about the way that the money is distributed right now?
I'm struggling a bit with the carceral system. It's a smaller amount than everything else, which does make me feel better. And I think that what you were saying earlier really it struck me because I feel like I hear what you're saying and I feel like you're making very great points when you were basically talking about someone to show up when things are needed. And I think the thing that I just struggle with is I don't think that someone should be the police.
Yeah, I'll add, actually, I'm also struggling a little bit with having some in the carceral system, even though, like you said, it isn't a lot. And I think similarly, what I'm hearing from folks is when crisis happens, what are we going to do to address that? And of course, we all want that addressed, we want to feel safe. But similarly, I think what would it look like to imagine that outside of police?
even though we don't, personally, I feel like we don't really have a good history with this. It's on the board, and so like we don't just put our money there because it's an option. But I wouldn't put $50 there, which is why I'm only gonna put 4. But I hope my 4 goes to the right places within it, which is why.
Yeah, especially with police accountability.
Yeah.
It's where we are versus where we want to be.
This is great. I really appreciate the conversation and you all listening to one another. Looking at your budget, do you all feel comfortable with locking this budget in? Is there anything you would like to move to a different category?
Yeah, you're thinking in terms of like percentage, right, of like the whole pie.
Like how we're, I think
Yeah.
that's a good way to think about
Yeah,
it.
it's like a quarter of the budget is going to housing right now. And we have a bit more than a quarter going to health, which seem like the biggest two. So it's like 14, 16, and 15. So that's like kind of around the same from early childhood.
Early childhood education and
Sure. Yes.
Do folks agree?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thumbs up? Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
How does this look?
I'm gonna propose something. I think, of course, we all decide as a community, but like, since like when we were talking about the carceral system, what we kept referring back to was like health, especially.
That's true.
Maybe moving some from the carceral system to health, just because I'm thinking about like, when I engage in this, like I'm trying to build like the world I want.
That's true.
And I would similarly like someone to respond to crises that's like loving and supportive and caring. So I propose maybe taking some from the carceral system and moving it. I would say maybe since like I said, since we're thinking about this as a community, maybe like 2 and 1 to housing and 1 to health. But what do other people think?
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
How does this budget look like to you all? Does this feel good?
Yeah.
Oh, y'all doing thumbs up? Oh my gosh, y'all, we have a budget. Well, y'all have a budget. Congratulations.
They did it. Came up with a budget. And you saw Tiffany getting in there, like, let me move this stuff around, Yeah, so what did you notice about how that process went? Again, if we're thinking about it as you being the facilitator in this kind of a conversation, what did you notice about how the facilitator kind of prompted this process to move people to get to a place where they felt good and this was the final allocation that they had collectively decided on? So feel free to comment in the chat, or if you'd like to come off and voice your answer, that is okay as well. Yeah, there was some compromising, absolutely. Yep. What else did you notice? And how did the facilitator really help to prompt the group along to get to the final? Hearing people out, absolutely. Yeah, left quiet space. I can do that now too. Be quiet. The facilitator wanted to make sure there was consensus around the decisions to make sure everyone was good with the plan. Absolutely. So as Tiffany was trying to move the chips, the facilitator said, is everybody okay with that? So that was important. Absolutely. Agreement from all participants that all opinions are valid. Yes. I like that there was space for people to be honest about what they were struggling with. Absolutely. Yeah. And the use of the thumbs up was a good way to signal consensus. Yes. Yeah. And even that final, I thought it was interesting to notice that final comment from the young woman who said, I have a suggestion, and was a little shy in suggesting it, but that also speaks to the fact that the facilitator created an environment where, you know, she felt comfortable saying, hey, I think I want to propose something. And then it turned out everyone was all right with it, you know, so yeah. And even where there was some conflict around, like, I'm struggling with this piece of it, let's talk it through. And the group was kind of able to say, all right, I'm okay with this. What if we do that? To get to that final. Oh, yes, Tiffany.
Something else that the facilitator did at the end was say, like, we have our final budget, and like named it as like our budget. And it just, like, I know as a participant, like I was like, oh wait, like now I'm proud, like we did it. Like it felt like a collective act. I mean, it literally was, but like, because we didn't all know each other, you know, like, so many of us met that day. And it felt like we did a thing together that we could collectively be proud of. And so that was exciting. And it, like, I don't know, it gave the energy to be like, we got to do something with this, you know?
Absolutely. That is true. And I think the young woman also said, I know this is our budget. And so, like, even there was a reference to, like, this is ours, like we're making it right now, which is pretty cool that there's some, so you're getting buy-in and ownership from the participants as you're working through this process of allocating those budget chips, which is really nice. It's a nice part of the process. Yeah, and I think we kind of talked through some of the prompts for getting folks to talk through their rationale around the allocations and then ultimately getting to that agreement. So let's pivot and get into the activation part of the conversation. So this will be the final portion of the video that we'll watch together, and then we'll get into a little bit of more of the open discussion after we watch this and talk through the activation piece. So just a heads up that if you've got some questions percolating, we will have some time to do that. So we'll pause here, and then Tiffany will play the next clip.
What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pass these around. Again, it has like the categories, and then you're gonna place your quantities in these little boxes. You're gonna write what you all created in these little boxes. So pass 2 this way, 3 that way.
These are so beautiful.
Yeah, awesome. You will have 100. So 28 for health, 13 education, 25 housing, 15 infrastructure, 17 community resources, and 2 carceral systems.
Yeah.
So when you're ready, if you could open up this little flap right here, and we will see how the city actually spends the money. So you might be surprised.
Yeah.
So for every $100 that you all spend, so you spend $28 for every 100 on health, the city only spends $8.83. So that's like 20%, $20 less than you all.
Well, now we know what everybody thinking.
Yeah.
No, that's.
Or at least what the people,
Yeah.
higher powers.
For education, you all said 13 for every 100. The city invests $8.67. So even though you all took money away from early childhood education, the city still spends significantly less than you all. For housing, so sad.
Yeah.
$25 for every 100 you all put into housing. The city only spends $3.25. Yeah. Yes. You're like, I got something to say.
So who thinks, like, I just want to know, who out there thinks that a carceral system is more important than health? Like,
Right.
And that's why the alderman and the mayor and the city has to understand that they work for us. And like the budget that you created is very similar to the budget that folks across the city are creating. And it's not reflected upon what the city actually spends its money on. So it's like, how are we holding our elected officials accountable to being like, listen, I just had this amazing workshop with my neighbors, with my friends, with my coworkers, and this is the budget that we created that is going to allow our neighborhood and community to be safe and thriving. And having conversations and adding pressure to them to like listen and really like make sure that like this budget is actually what is being passed in city council and not this. This is like 31% of the budget goes to policing. Yeah. 31% goes to policing, but only 0.10 goes to COPA. So I know folks are like, I wanted to go to, so even the 31%, it's like less than a percentage goes to police accountability. But what we really want when we think about safe and thriving communities, you said like, we don't need police. You all just defunded the police with your budget. So when people say defund the police, this is what they mean. They mean invest in health, invest in education, invest in housing, invest in infrastructure, invest in community resources. So do you all see your values represented within the city's budget?
No, not at all.
So we're gonna continue to work to create an accountability structure, wanting to see from you all, either you could nominate yourself, you could nominate someone else to be your city budget representatives for this group. So the city budget representative would be representing this community and the budget that you just created, and would be lifting up your values and speaking with elected officials and engaging with other folks from different communities that share the same values as you all. So I don't know if you all want to nominate yourself or nominate someone else, but they would have to accept the nomination.
Lewis, first off, because he's not ignorant, like I can tell he's educated, but also humble at the same time. I feel like he would be a good person to like talk to people with power and people in other communities.
That's wild, because I was gonna nominate you, Tim.
Yeah.
And my why is because you were very clearly like invested in this process. I think even when you didn't agree with people or people didn't agree with you, you were comfortable continuing the conversation, which I think is the type of thing we would need when it comes to pushing like older people, right? So I nominate you.
I just want to say that I feel like you all have been amazing and could all probably represent your communities and know where your values are. We're going to be bringing folks together from different neighborhoods who have also been nominated, who have self-nominated themselves to represent their budgets that they created, to have meetings with their aldermen, talking to your neighbors about this, and making sure that your values are being heard and represented as the city is moving on with their city budget process. But you won't be alone. There's going to be a lot of you all. There's going to be me and other folks also.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with those two.
Yay. So what we want to do is we want to add pressure to aldermen because they do a lot more than fill and fix potholes. They have control over how health is funded, how education is funded, how all this is funded. And they're policymakers as well. They're not just public servants, they're policymakers, and they have a lot of influence on what's happening in your community and are working for you. So adding pressure to your aldermen to also vote no or yes on a budget that reflects your values and your priorities. So that's the city budget. We're gonna keep engaging, we're gonna keep pushing. Before we close, I'm gonna ask you all if you could help fill this out as well.
All right. Lots of agreement that she's an excellent facilitator. So this is a great demonstration video. But let's talk a little bit about what Andrea did to really activate the group. Like, why was this considered the activation part of the meeting, and how did she really promote that? So does anyone want to come off of mute and talk, or feel free to drop it in the chat? Whatever you prefer. You know, it takes a little time to type sometimes. But if anyone's not shy, we would love to hear your voices too. So
Could you repeat the question, please?
yes, yes. So what did the facilitator do to really activate the group? So they went through the budget allocation process. They created their own community budget that reflected their values. And so how did the conversation then turn into an action-oriented conversation? So we just want to kind of talk to the tactical part. Yes, yes, you bet.
I think one highlight of her moderating that conversation was her taking a stance, in a sense, like her providing some pieces of information around accountability for who is responsible to align some of the values with what is actually happening in the budget. So I know that sometimes with, you know, research or interviews, you want to remain like an outsider, but I really appreciated that she was able to convey this idea that people deserve, and what we're experiencing is unusual, that we're already so used to the way that the city is. So I think it was a good moment of clarity for her to express like the desire for change or for impact.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like related to that, Vet, like it felt like what was activating was like the shock value of like how different the budget that the group came up with was compared to the actual distribution of the Chicago city budget, like which is like exactly what you're saying, like sharing information, but like it was really that comparison that was like, oh, like what? Like it was just so starkly different. That's like we have to do something about this.
Absolutely. And even oh, please, Caroline, feel free. Jump in
Something
here.
else I really enjoyed that the facilitator did was talked about how they were trying to activate other folks from different communities. Because I think sometimes when you're thinking about working as just a single individual, it feels like very overwhelming. But knowing that there are other people who are joining in and are being a part of this movement can help motivate others to get involved.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, Andrea made it a point to say, you know, after that big reveal and the shock value of like, look how different your values are versus how the city and the alder people and the mayor are allocating, excuse me, our tax dollars. And then in addition to that, she said, and you're not alone. When we went and talked to other people in the city, they're doing similar things. Like the money is being allocated in similar ways. So then you feel a part of a team, like you feel a part of a whole city that's saying the same thing, which becomes a very empowering, excuse me, place to kind of then talk about things, right? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I love the reveal process of like, okay, put in your numbers, and then it's like, and now reveal. Here's how the city actually allocated. Okay, and Stephanie says she reminded the group that alders are also policymakers, essentially making clear how power works. Absolutely. An important point. Yeah. And it's a little bit of that educational piece too. They don't just do potholes, like they're also policymakers, and a reminder around that. Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Tiffany.
Yeah, I want to also just make a connection from this session to another session that we've had in the class If you all think back to the beginning of the semester when we did our power mapping activity with Public Health Awakens, and we were, thinking about, okay, where might people fall on this power map? You can consider tools like this participatory budgeting process, like these budgeting parties, as power building tools, right? Like these are ways to share information, build relationships, build capacity around the city budgeting process and other like political policy and like governance processes in the city. And then like do a thing with that. So yeah, I just want to encourage you all to think about some of these different tools that we're learning in the class as like, these are a thing in and of themselves, but also they're a way to build power towards some other like larger campaign or activity.
Absolutely. Excuse me. So really key points there, and building on what you just offered up as well, Tiffany, that there's a really important need to acknowledge that civic trauma is prevalent and real. And so there's a heavy distrust across the city, no matter what neighborhood you're in, really transparently, that folks don't believe their voices matter a lot of times, especially in disinvested communities. There is this knowing and experience and history that shows that even when we show up, or even when we make our voices heard, we still may not get the things that we need in our communities. So you're up against that reality that is very real. And so to shift the conversation, and really a part of this participatory process is to be empowering to the people who are present. Again, the idea is to center the voices of those most impacted to the issues in the community. And so to say you're not alone, and there are people all across the city that believe the same things that you do, and you can take action on this right now, and here's a way to do it. And so that kind of led into identifying community representatives right there on the spot at the end of the conversation. And so why do you think that was an important strategy too? And kind of what does that help to do within this group? Thanks, Tiffany. So they just had a great conversation around, what their values are, allocated their budget chips, came to agreement around their final budget, and then found out, oh my goodness, the city is in real misalignment to the values that we hold as a community. And so right on the spot, the facilitator said, okay, we're going to have a couple of people from this group be budget representatives. So why do you think that was a strategy that she used? So Gabrielle says, foster a sense of ownership by electing someone to share their thoughts and budgets. Yeah, absolutely. That was absolutely the role of the community rep, or the community representative who was nominated right there on the spot. And then again, speaking to that, the civic trauma that is often present and this feeling of disempowerment. Well, hey, whether you are the person that gets nominated or you nominate someone who you may have not met, number one, that feels great to be nominated by your group. But then secondly, also, you've made some new friends and connections, and you also all share the same values because you just created a budget together. So you know that your voice is going to be carried forward by these two individuals that you just built a relationship with and kind of did this activity. So it's a great way to also not hesitate or delay, like, oh, next week we're going to choose, two representatives from this conversation we had last week. Nope, it's like, while it's happening right now, let's do this and identify, and here's what that means, so that it's like, let's keep the conversation rolling, keep the momentum rolling, and we're clear about where we're headed, right? So, and we're getting, oh, I missed a couple of, okay, to ensure the conversation energy. Yep, doesn't end there. Having a spokesperson to synthesize the group's ideas and be the face. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the intent for sure of having those representatives. Another kind of expectation, and again, I mentioned that part of my role with the People's Budget was to work with the community representatives. And so part of what those representatives committed to do was to continually circle back with their neighbors and with folks who may have been present for that meeting to give progress updates and get feedback along the way. And after they went and met with the alderperson and then come back and report back to people. So again, this was a way to kind of keep the conversation going among the group. And so we're entering into the portion where we do want to open it up for Q&A. So I just want to flag that, and so we can keep it rolling. One question I can also just pose to the group as we do that too is, again, as you're thinking about the composition of the groups that you might form to have a discussion like this around a participatory budget process, what are some considerations that you may think about, especially for some of you in the room may actively be seasoned community organizers? We'd love to hear your wisdom in the room of what are some other considerations to think about. For example, if you've got people who maybe aren't from the same neighborhood, maybe they're coming from different neighborhoods and different wards, so they would have different alder people that they would talk to. So that's one dynamic that could be at play. What are some other things to consider as you're compiling a group of people together to do something like this? No wrong answers. So feel free to throw out some considerations you would think about.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Was there also a discussion on where precisely the money is going into within those buckets? Just like, how are they itemized?
Yeah, so that does get into more of the nitty gritty. I don't think we plan to do that in this particular conversation. But I think if there's interest in that, we can maybe continue just talking about that, Tiffany and Yvette, and or even if there's some follow-up materials that we can gather and send, we'd be happy to do that too. You'll see a little bit of it. It's not comprehensive because, again, city budgets are often just arduous and very complex. And then there are sister agencies. So the city budget has certain departments that comprise what is considered the city budget. And then there's things like Chicago Housing Authority, for example. That's its whole other entity. They have a whole other separate process. And, they're responsible for housing predominantly. So things get complex when you start to think about, oh, well, there are other pieces of publicly funded services that may or may not be included in this picture. All of it is still relevant. It's still a relevant conversation to have. But when you get into some of that nuance and get into the actual numbers, you kind of uncover some of those details as well, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
No, keep going,
go
please.
ahead. Yeah, the one thing I was thinking about was just the recent Bring Chicago Home proposal and how the idea of it sounds great, but the people voted no. And so it just made me curious as to like where exactly was the money going for that initiative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have that information for sure. I don't know if anyone else in the room may have just insight to share around that question.
Well, what I was gonna add was just to say, I think that when you're trying to engage in participatory processes that where ultimately the goal is to bring people together to like build capacity together. I think sometimes you do have to like focus on, like, keep the main thing, and kind of focus, like have conversations that might be a bit more broad strokes so that we can like have the conversation together. Because, you know, these sessions are bringing together like intergenerational groups of folks, people who, you know, oftentimes were not previously thinking about the city budget, you know, in these ways at all. And so once people were selected as their representatives from their different people's budget pop-ups, that's what we were calling them, or people's budget parties, they worked more closely with Adria. And the sort of like nitty-gritty that you're like asking about, that's the kind of stuff that they learned as they were really building their toolbox to go hard in their conversations with their older people. So, you know, in the broader conversation, no, it didn't get into the nitty-gritty. And I think that that was for the best, because I think that you might have lost people, and then all of that energy and excitement and enthusiasm that people just built up because they feel like they learned a thing and they did a thing, you might, you know, then break that down by just getting a bit too in the weeds. So I think an important like takeaway, I guess, from this is just when to be broad and when to be very like narrow and specific. And I think these participatory budgeting sessions are the time to be broad and bring more people together.
I think that's a great point. Yeah. Yeah, it can get complex fast. And so, and nuance is important, and speaking to some of those differences is important. But again, there's strategy and really the activating principles at play of like, how do you get folks interested and desiring to get involved and feeling heard and seen right here in the moment, so that you can leverage that and carry it forward to then keep that action going. Oh yeah.
Steph asked in the chat if anyone asked to create new categories in any of these sessions.
Yeah, so I did not witness anyone asking for new categories, but it's a great question.
Yeah, no, it is a great question, Steph. And I also didn't witness anyone asking to create new categories. And I will say, so I study subjective well-being, just for all of y'all here. And so a part of that is understanding the things that shape what it takes to be well. And it's pretty consistent. Like, I think if we did a poll of this group of folks here, we would probably come up with a pretty consistent set of things. And those things are pretty well represented actually in those existing budget categories. So yeah, so I do think that it's interesting that over all the different pop-ups that I've attended, no one asked about new categories.
Yeah, it's almost like we're just trying to work with what we have, right? And so I want to also lift up a comment from the chat. I know there's many comments in the chat, and sorry we haven't been able to address those if we haven't, but Shannon at 702 mentioned one consideration is for people who are undocumented. Their opinions still matter and are valued, but there is often a fear to participate in spaces like this for fear of being discovered as undocumented or stirring the pot in the city and putting themselves or their family at risk. That could be a potential gap in representation. And you know, it brings to mind like this conversation around like who is represented, who isn't, who should be there, who are the key actors, what does power mean, right? And so I just feel like this opens up like a whole world of recognizing like what people deserve and rights as well. And that's what I meant by that comment, like people just try their best with what they have. And I think in a segregated city like this one that has a lot of deep pockets that lean towards political, you know, processes before community. I think people are just like very, speaking as a Chicagoan, just a little bit bogged down by these processes and how they've happened in the past. So I just wanted to highlight that as well from my experience, because it's, I don't know other cities I haven't lived in, but I know this city has like the city of big shoulders. So sometimes things are said to go somewhere budgeted wise, but then they go over here. So I don't know if that's corruption everywhere.
Yeah, great points. And thank you for lifting up the comment in the chat. And I know there was a speaker who came off mute and said something similar around undocumented folks in the city who it's a very real consideration. And again, as a facilitator doing a gathering of this sort, one of the strategies that we even saw in the video was writing postcards. And so it's a great way to have tangible evidence that these are real people with real concerns, and they don't have to have identifying information, right? And so that's one way to ensure that those voices are heard. And also, again, like the way that Chicago United for Equity organized and partnered with community-based organizations was leveraging the trust and relationship built with those community-based organizations, so that the individuals living in the communities know, like, well, I trust this partner organization, this community organization. And so if they're saying, if they're inviting me into this conversation, then I think it's okay. And then, you know, we can have a discussion. So those are just some considerations to address specifically that issue of, you know, undocumented folks who might be trepidatious to have a conversation like this. I know earlier in the chat, someone also offered up unhoused individuals who also have perspective and voice that are really important to hear from in this process as well. Again, multi-generational. So if you talk to a senior versus a young person, you'll have varying perspectives and values, all of them.
Right. So important to think about those vulnerable populations that are the ones at greatest risk of these social inequities. I really want to thank you so much for speaking with us today. I feel like this brought up a lot of ideas that we generate little bit in what we're understanding in the public health practice. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. So we just want to give Adria a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for having me.
And just a reminder, on April 25th, we're having a hybrid class. So you can join us in person at the School of Public Health or on Zoom, and then we'll have some more details next week about that. Next week, we also have Rachel Lyons presenting on mutual aid jail support and the end of money bond campaign. So please join us next week. I also want to point to the chat. There was something listed around an opportunity to work with Chicago United for Equity. So please view that. And if it's of interest to you, please contact them. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. I want to just direct the students to our private breakout room and we'll get started right away. Thank you. And for community members, please feel free to stay. We'll be here until 7:30. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Adrian.